Who are the Russian Germans, and when and why did they arrive on the banks of the Volga River? What was the German diaspora, and what mark did it leave on the history of Russian peoples? From 1941 to the 1990s, and in Imperial Russia before that, little was said to even acknowledge the existence of this ethnic group. Only with the beginning of perestroika during the 1980s did discussion arise relating to the problem of establishing sovereignty for Russian, or as they were called at the time, Soviet Germans. There was also talk about the possible emigration of these Soviet citizens to their historically native land of Germany. For many Russians, it was almost insulting that towards the end of the 20th century, almost 2 million people of German descent resided in the USSR. Many believed that these people had formerly been prisoners of war or immigrants. Scholars were prohibited from conducting research on Russian Germans. Journalists weren't allowed to publish anything concerning their lives or their history. As a result, after several decades, Soviet people simply didn't know who these Germans were. They had no idea that, at the time, 1,200,000 Germans resided on Russian soil.
Так кто же они, российские немцы? Когда и как появились колонисты на Волге?
So who are these Russian Germans? When and how did colonists arrive on the Volga? The majority of such Germans came to Russia during the rule of Catherine II, who was at the time busy colonizing land surrounding the empire. Europe was weakened during this period. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, the agrarian overpopulation, which didn't give its citizens ample land to farm, and religious purges over the following 2 centuries led many to seek happiness and opportunity in the New World. Some found this new world in Russia, which had both free space and hidden treasure.
Таким новым светом стала Россия, где как раз были и незаселенные пространства, и скрытые богатства.
То, что в Германии была тяжелейшая ситуация, то, что каждое небольшое графство с друг другом воевали, это
The terrible conditions and constant fighting between the counties made people seek out ways to leave and places to go. Meanwhile, Russia had been considering issuing an invitation for about 15 years. So really, this wasn't Catherine's document, it was in the works going back to the 1740s. And Russia was keeping a close watch on what other governments, Prussia, Denmark, were offering, how they were attracting people to immigrate. So, in 1762, Russian diplomats gathered all of this information and created a document of invitation that combined all the offerings of the European countries and offered just a little bit more. So, people came to Russia. On December 4th, 1762, a manifesto of invitation printed in 5 languages was approved by Catherine II. It offered foreigners the possibility to immigrate to all regions of the Russian Empire. Those arriving in Russia were promised land and multiple benefits. The Russian government paid for all travel expenses. Each immigrant could choose his or her place of residence and occupation, and immigrants were exempt from all government service.
Ему была гарантирована свобода от гражданской службы и воинской повинности.
Colonies were also exempt from taxes and had the right to sell goods without paying any fees. Each German family received from the government 2 horses, 1 cow, seeds for sowing, and farming tools. In the list of places that were free and ready for colonization was Saratov, famous at that time for its fresh and cured fish industries. And so, Saratov was to become a new home for a group of immigrants that came to be known as the Volga Germans. In the beginning of the 18th century, the southeastern border of the Russian Empire was still fairly uncultivated. At the time, it was used mainly by nomads and herders, and agriculture didn't take root in these areas until the latter half of the 1700s. After the promulgation of the manifesto signed by Catherine II on July 22nd of 1763, the first string of German families started to arrive from a Germany torn up by the 7 Years' War. The main motive for migration was the search for new land and opportunity to establish business. The majority of newcomers arrived from the southwestern areas of Germany: Württemberg, Baden, Hessen, Schwabenland, Pfalz, Saxony, as well as from Bavaria, East Thüringen, and Westphalian dukedoms. Immigrants differed in their dialects, religious traditions, cultures, and habits. Among them were Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, Baptists, Adventists, and Mennonites. Early arrivals into Saratov province of the Volga region, today's territories of Samara, Volgograd, and Saratov provinces, consisted of 70% Protestants and 30% Catholics. Though the numbers changed somewhat during the 19th century, the proportion always remained roughly 3 to 1, with Protestants always outnumbering Catholics. According to documents of that time, which are now in archives, foreign soil brought together two factions that were once enemies. Many Lutherans and Catholics worshipped and held services together. Such examples existed in Saratov, Ust-Zalikha, and other early settlements. Due to a lack of clergy, all services, regardless of denomination, were conducted by a single priest. This minister could be of Catholic, Lutheran, or other Protestant faith. All were acceptable. This unified kind of priest held all the usual types of services, including baptisms, marriages, and funerals.
Таинство крещения, венчания, отпевания, и проводил богослужения как для лютеран, так и для католиков одновременно.
Immigrants who arrived in Russia didn't only come from Germany, but also Switzerland, France, Austria, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, and Poland. All of these groups were called German colonists by Russians, which became the standard name for any Europeans who didn't speak Russian. Groups of immigrants started to arrive in German seaports in 1763 and 1764, and from there they traveled to St. Petersburg. Those who swore an oath of loyalty to the Empress were transported on carts over the northern regions of Russia to the upper Volga. And then they sailed on barges for 2,000 kilometers until they reached this steppe that they were destined to cultivate. Even after they were invited, it was difficult for Europeans to actually leave for Russia. Many had debts that the Russian government would have to pay for them. Then Germans traveled through Lübeck and partially through Danzig, where their passports and documents were often taken to prevent them from emigrating. An agent who confiscated a would-be immigrant's documents received a reward. Those Germans who actually managed to leave were put onto boats and traveled to Russia, first through Kronstadt and then to the mainland. These ships were packed with as many people as possible, and the 12 to 14-day journey to St. Petersburg was very difficult and very uncomfortable. After arrival, migrants lived in Oranienbaum on the outskirts of Petersburg, while necessary clothes were obtained for them. The trip from Petersburg to Saratov took almost a year. When colonists finally arrived in Saratov, they were housed in temporary barracks, after which they were moved to their permanent places of residence. The idea that immigrants were simply thrown into the open expanse of uncultivated fields is a myth. The Russian government thoroughly prepared for the arrival of Europeans and hired carpenters from the upper reaches of the Volga specifically to build houses for the newcomers.
Верховья Волги, Средней Волги, в Саратов. И они активно строили дома для переселенцев.
На новом месте каждой немецкой семье
Once in Russia, each family received 15 desятин of land, which equates to about 110 acres. Half of this land was appropriated for plowing and sowing, approximately a third for haymaking, and the rest of the land became a personal plot for miscellaneous use. Part of the land was left on reserve for future generations.
Стал вопрос о том, в какой форме будет земля. Споры шли. Первоначально предполагалось это передать в собственность, но в собственности передавать было сложно. Колонисты ехали с большими долгами. То есть им выплачивали деньги подъемные, когда они
When Germans
уезжали
first
там.
colonized, the first question was, in what form will land be given to them?
Деньги надо платить.
An early
Прибыли
suggestion was to
в
simply
Петербург.
allow settlers to own land, but that was difficult.
Говоря современным языком,
Colonists accumulated a lot of debt by the time they arrived in Russia. The Russian government paid for the boat trip to St. Petersburg and gave them money once they arrived. Homes built for the colonists cost about 450 rubles. A horse, in comparison, cost 8 rubles.
Плюс они здесь жили до первого урожая, им тоже платили суточные. То есть накапливался очень большой долг.
Plus, before their first harvest, colonists were given money, so they accumulated a lot of debt in total. To tie the colonists down, a good system of land use had to be devised. The most serious idea was to make the land communal, locking Germans to the land by the debts that they now owed to the Russian government.
То их везли до Саратова. Это был безвозвратный долг. То есть это деньги, которые не возвращались.
Today some say, why did the Russian government need to build such expensive houses? Small ones could have been cheaper.
Деньги, все это уже был возвратный долг. И вот сейчас задали вопрос, зачем нужно было такие дома строить, такое хозяйство? Ну, сделали.
But the thing is, people who were in charge of organizing this weren't dumb. The large sums of money paid to the German immigrants also locked them to the land. They could only leave once they paid off all their debts.
Он сначала должен считаться долгами, а потом уже уехать. То есть таким образом фактически отъезд колонистов назад был решен при помощи экономического закабаления.
Колонии застраивались после межевания земель.
Colonies were built after surveys of the land according to special plans. Colonists were accommodated in accordance with the relief of the landscape. The key condition was the presence of a water source. Colonists set up residence on the banks of this river Karamysh. Several villages were built along this very river. On the shore we found this millstone. The village Kuter was on the other bank, and a mill likely stood here. The water level was probably higher, and there was probably a mill pond here. This millstone is still here because it's simply impossible to move it. And here was the German village of Kratsky. The first colonists had to build their homes from this material. Stone, straw, clay, and dung. This wall is still standing. After almost 250 years, one can still see on the Volga territory the original villages, in which there are still homes that were built for the German colonists. It's amazing that some of the homes are still inhabited, which is a testament to their durability. Some of the homes are very good, very sturdy. Others were built from unfinished, unbaked bricks. The thing is, the first homes that the colonists were put up in were made of raw logs. These homes stood for maybe 30 years, through the late 1700s and into the early 19th century. Later, Germans started to build their own houses according to their ways of living. Mostly these houses were rather durable, but due to the social stratification towards the middle of the 19th century, some people could afford really nice homes, and others had to use really cheap materials.
материалы для этих целей. Большая часть домов была
Clay and
заброшена.
bricks
Но дело в том,
don't
что
burn,
когда,
but wooden
немцы
logs do.
выселили эти
That's why in
самые
1941, when Germans were evicted from the Volga region, their homes were taken apart and used for firewood.
рубленые, они горят, поэтому
And
родня,
actually,
зачем
some of the stone
разбирали
churches were
для
taken
того,
apart
чтобы
too,
топить.
and
А
the
вот,
brick was
например,
used to build
некоторые
fortifications
церкви,
around Stalingrad.
использовали, разбирали в период Великой Отечественной войны, перевозили на восстановление Волгограда, это тоже было. Поэтому эти дома в большей степени пострадали.
Жизнь первых поселенцев оказалась далеко не легкой. Сложные условия ведения
The lives of the
сельского
first
хозяйства,
colonists were far from
непрерывные
easy.
засухи летом и
They faced the
сильные
challenges of
морозы
starting and
зимой,
maintaining a
часто
farming
сводившие на
lifestyle,
нет затраченный труд.
lengthy droughts and deep
Колонистам
frosts in the
приходилось
winter.
отражать и внезапные набеги
Colonists even had to
рабочих
defend
народов.
themselves from sudden invasions by nomadic people of the steppe. According to archival data, the last invasions in the colonies occurred in the 1780s. After that, portions of the Russian army situated themselves in several key areas: North Schaffhausen proper, East Mariental proper, and then around Rovny.
Везде стояли русские воинские подразделения. Они сначала их не ставили, думали, что не будет проблем. Как только в
In August of 1774, Kyrgyz and Kaysak tribes invaded and pillaged the German colonies 3 times. This happened because at the time, the Russian army had to leave for a war with Pugachev, leaving the colonies defenseless. The Kyrgyz people saw this and took advantage of the army's absence. The government had to send troops back to the colonies, and the army built fortifications and dug trenches around the villages in order to prevent another invasion.
Рыли валы вокруг колонии для того, чтобы этого не допустить.
Но все же постепенно засушливая степь осваивалась, возникали благоустроенные
Slowly,
населенные
the dry
пункты,
steppe was
вырастали
cultivated.
сады.
Villages
Создание
grew,
колоний
gardens
на Волге шло
bloomed.
по нарастающей.
More and more
В
colonies were being
1765
created on the Volga.
12 колоний.
In 1765, 12 colonies. In 1766, 21. In 1767, the number rose to 67. According to letters exchanged between immigrants, in 1769, 6,500 families lived in 105 colonies. In comparison, that's twice as many people as all colonists present in all settlements in Canada for that year. During the 100 years between 1764 and 1864, 190 colonies emerged in the Samara and Saratov regions. My entire family was born here, and I found out from my parents that Catherine invited us here. She was the Tsarina of Russia and permitted Germans to live on the banks of the Volga. Some of my ancestors went even farther. This was maybe 200 years ago, maybe even more. When I was very little, we ran to the river to bathe. On the other side of the river was a huge forest. We had a really happy childhood, and we lived very well. In the spring of 1766, the Office of Guardianship of Foreigners, Tutelkanzlei in German or Kantora in Russian, was formed in Saratov due to the dramatic increase of immigrants in the area. Almost 250 years since, we have the opportunity to see the unique documents that reveal the function of that office. Priceless documents are now stored in the government archives of Saratov. By these documents, we can trace the history of the Volga Germans. Here we have the lists of the first colonists who came by boat to Russia in 1766 from Lubeck. These lists go by family. Here they're listed in chronological order, starting with the first families, their names, family members by age, religion, their place of residence at the time of departure, and where they want to live in Russia and what they want to do for work. If we open any list of immigrants that came on the ship from Lubeck, we can read vital information on the colonists. Forstenger Brabant, his wife Susanna, son Johann, daughters Mariana and Theresa. Each person's age is also indicated. We can read that this family was Catholic, that by profession they were farmers, and wanted to pursue growing wheat in Russia. There's an enormous amount of interest for scholars in the Mogilев and Tiraspol collections that are stored in our archive. In these collections, there are almost 1,500 files. What people look for most often are the files with birth, marriage, and death information for Volga Germans. A unique characteristic of these archival collections is the presence of registers, books that contain birth, death, and marital and familial information on colonists who lived in the south of Russia. These documents came into our hands because the Mogilев and Tiraspol diocese extended over very large territories, several counties. These registers were created in duplicates. The original stayed in its place of creation, and the other was sent to the archives in Saratov. One can imagine the value of these documents, considering that the southern extreme of the former Russian Empire and the Soviet Union suffered greatly in both the Civil War and World War I, and the original registers were lost. But we have the copies, which are used with great demand by scholars.
Российской империи бывшей и Советского Союза очень сильно пострадали в ходе войн, как Первой мировой, так и Великой Отечественной. И на местах практически эти документы не сохранились, зато сохранились у нас. И они пользуются огромным спросом среди исследователей.
Уникальные документы можно увидеть и в Государственном
Unique
историческом
documents can also be found in the National Historic Archive of German Russians in Engels. Of the 229,000 files that exist there, 195,000 are directly associated with the history of German Russians, starting with their arrival on the banks of the Volga in 1764 and ending with their deportation in 1941. These documents contain the official government invitations, information about the economic status of the colonies, letters exchanged between colonists, court cases, and files from town offices and churches. The archive contains maps of the lands that were set aside for colonies and building plans for churches. Despite the fact that many documents were lost in several fires that have happened since the 1960s, our archive has materials from the 19th and 20th centuries that contain the entire history of the German-Russian community. Of course, these are not local lore or legends, but historical artifacts. The unique files contained in the Saratov National Archives can become an invaluable resource for academic research of Volga German history. Up to now, research on the subject has been based mainly on secondary sources, given that the Soviet government closed the archives to scholars. Now the situation has improved. As a result of cooperation between archivists and historians, we can see the publication of research based on the one-of-a-kind documents contained in the Saratov archives. For many years, the documentation reserves were practically closed off. It was prohibited to allow these files to be used in the reading room, for them to be cited in studies, and this was basically the situation until the 1990s. Victor Hurt of the University of Göttingen still remembers his first visit here, and he says, "Elizabeth welcomed me, but she didn't show me anything, and didn't let me work. And how could I have?" But in the 90s, when the reserves were declassified, we started to actively publicize our GR archival collections for academic use. The situation has of course improved, and today, as a result of cooperation between archivists and scholars, many publications can arise on the foundations of the documents that are found in the Saratov National Archives. The main occupation of the first colonist was agriculture. Germans raised rye, wheat, oats, barley, and potatoes, which they first brought from their homeland. They rotated fields. One was used for rye and other bread crops or potatoes. Another grew wheat, and a third plot was left unplanted. The soil was turned using a wooden plow with a metal blade that was pulled by 2 or 3 horses. Then a metal harrow was drawn over the land. Crops were harvested by scythe and gathered into stacks and later stone ground.
60% были хлебопашцами, как так писали, и 40 других профессий. Те русские.
According to my analysis of historical documentation, 60% of colonists grew bread crops, and 40% had other professions. Colonies were organized by Russian officers, and those officers came from Central Russia. And their idea of agriculture was very incompatible with the local land and local climate. The Germans were given cattle, and officers made them plant rye. And what rye did they think would grow on the Volga?
Главный был лейтмотив. Немцы приехали, они бездельники, ничего не хотели делать, урожаев никаких. Первые годы
of course, their first crops failed.
Почему? Да потому что
even Russians didn't know how to grow crops in these areas. So the new land had to be cultivated through trial and error. For example, when the Germans came, they started to make these really tall rows, like one would in a really humid climate. And of course, on the Volga, the vegetables they grew immediately died. And the first few years, only watermelons grew well. So, colonists had a very hard time adjusting to this new land. That's why, until 1775, the government had to invest a lot of money to somehow aid the success of the colonies.
Государство постоянно вкладывало деньги, чтобы хоть как-то поддержать их возможности.
During the second half of the 19th century, agriculture modernized as traditional techniques were replaced by machines. The hardworking and adaptive Volga Germans were able to take on these new techniques and were thus much more successful farmers than their Russian and Ukrainian neighbors. In addition to farming, in the 19th century, Volga Germans became successful at making and selling goods. Immigrants built paper and textile mills, made leather products, and built plants for production of farming equipment. In Katharienstadt, there was a tobacco mill, many wood processing plants. There was a developing flour-making industry. The industry that was powered by colonists gained a market not only in Russia but also abroad. The flour-making industry developed, and it was created mainly by Germans. Schmitz, Reinecks, and Borels. They made their first capital on really basic fabric making, but you can't really make very much money on that. There were a lot of small mills situated on the smaller rivers in the area. Germans made these into a bigger, more serious business, and made Saratov the center of flour production. The same thing happened with growing and processing of tobacco. This all began in the colonies, but then grew to a much larger scale. And when the industry like that appears, you need transport. All this had a huge impact on Saratov, and the city really earned a name for itself.
Ну, а когда появляется такое производство, здесь требуется и транспорт, и все. Это взаимосвязано, это повлияло на Саратов, и здесь, я думаю, этим Саратов отметился очень серьезно.
With their high-quality produce and goods, the Volga Germans were formidable competitors to the local vendors that made business around central and upper regions of the Volga. The magnitude of the European colonization of Russia is often compared to the settlement of North America during the 18th century. German colonists of Russia, however, had far greater economic success than their American counterparts. The latter could not do without slave labor, government subsidies, or military aid.
Вклад несомненен. Дело в том, что
the impact of colonists on the advancement of industry along the Volga is indisputable. Saratov was always shaped largely by the production that Germans created. The phenomenon of immigrant architecture along the Volga is still largely unresearched. This architecture emerged from the melding of German traditions and the specific requirements of the Saratov climate, available resources, and lifestyles of the colonists. The development of such construction style started with stone buildings in the central Volga area of German residency. Germans had their own unique way of building brick residential houses, as well as industrial and public buildings. We have arrived in former Husenbach, which is now called the village Lignova. Unlike many other German settlements, which have now almost ceased to exist, Lignova is still inhabited in quite a big village. A lot of old German buildings are still standing. One of those is this pharmacy, which has been here since the end of the 19th century. Here we can see the date carved, indicating that the building was erected in 1890-something. The last digit is not visible now, but it is obvious that it was built in the last years of the 19th century. The main craft of the immigrants was the amazing talent of the masters and builders, who are often the architects and planners of their creations. As the workforce moved toward the cities starting with the 1860s, so did these craftsmen, thus leaving the colonies and heading for big industrial centers along the Volga.
Потянулись из колоний в крупные промышленно-торговые центры Поволжья.
Large German-owned corporations hired such architects, who built some of the most unique buildings that still define cities along the Volga.
До сих пор украшающих облик поволжских городов.
Steam-powered mills, the height of industrial advancement during the latter half of the 19th century, were also architectural marvels. Towers, parapets, spires, lattices, and coats of arms towered above all other city buildings and continue to amaze even today.
Полтора века назад возвышались над всей городской застройкой. Да и сейчас они продолжают удивлять своей монументальностью.
A loved pedestrian stretch for all residents of Saratov is Немецкая, or German Street. It was historically the location of a German settlement, but became the center of shopping and recreation toward the end of the 19th century. First, the street was just outside the city, and now it's in the very center. Slowly, the street gained such high significance that Russian merchants started to buy homes here, enroll their daughters in German schools, buy clothes for them in German stores. The first pharmacy in the city was opened on this street, the first school in the city, and undoubtedly, the street holds great significance not only for Germans, but all citizens of Greater Saratov. Here behind me was the Evangelical Lutheran Cathedral of St. Mary, which was built at the end of the 18th century. Saratov was one of the more important Lutheran centers in Russia, on the same level as Moscow and St. Petersburg. Here, right by the cathedral, was the Office of Guardianship of Foreigners, in addition to other important buildings, banks, textile mills, and hotels. The cathedral was truly a masterpiece of German architecture. It was built at the end of the 18th century and belonged to both Lutherans and Catholics. It was funded by its members, was rebuilt many times, and continuously increased in size until it was demolished in the 1970s. For a long time, the building was home to a savings bank, a puppet theater, and of course, when it was demolished, the city was robbed of a very beautiful piece of architecture, in place of which now stands a featureless building that belongs to Saratov State Agriculture University. The stone residential houses on the central streets of Saratov, built in modern style, still impress with their architecture and prestigious symbolic character. However, although part of the city buildings are presently maintained and restored, the condition of the vast majority of village architecture is absolutely catastrophic. Slowly, the unique buildings are reduced to ruins. We are losing cultural monuments, industrial buildings, residential houses, and schools. Historians and architects say that if some measures to preserve this inheritance aren't taken immediately, we will lose any evidence of immigrant culture and history.
будет уже бессмысленно говорить о переселенческой культуре как о явлении. Исчезнут с лица земли сами ее произведения.
When I visit the German colonies, I always think that I am walking in the footsteps of a dead civilization.
Не просто по немецким колониям, а я иду по следам умершей культуры.
No matter what you say to try and convince me otherwise, the culture of German Russians is gone. The people went back to Germany. Those who stayed in Russia partially assimilated. And nobody is carrying the cultural heritage.
Те, кто остались в России, они в большей части ассимилированы, и поэтому здесь, если мы говорим о настоящей,
If we are talking about that original culture of Russian Germans, the one that was formed during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, then it doesn't exist anymore. It's only history.
Связующая нить между прошлым и нынешним
The threads
временем
connecting the
чудом
past and the
уцелевшие
present
лютеранские
are the
и
Lutheran and
католические
Catholic
храмы
churches of the 18th and 19th centuries,
XVIII-XIX
miraculously preserved along the Volga River.
до наших дней. В прошлом в некоторых селах
In the
было даже
past,
по 3-4
some villages had maybe
церкви,
3 or
в основном
4 churches,
лютеранские.
mostly
Были хоть и в
Lutheran,
меньшем
though there were a good
количестве
number of
католические.
Catholic ones too.
Сейчас почти все они в
Now,
полуразрушенном
almost all of
состоянии.
them are half
Первые
destroyed.
годы после поселений у
In the early stages of
колоний, у
colonization,
священников
immigrants
не было
didn't have the
возможности
opportunity to
строить
fund the
церкви
building
за
of their
свой
own
счет.
churches,
Поэтому
so the
государство
government
выделяет
gave them
средства на
money.
сооружение церквей. И только в первые
Only in their
15-20
first
лет
15
было
or 20
построено уже
years,
около 30
Germans built
церквей
around
по
30
всему
churches
Поволжью.
along the Volga.
Естественно, к началу 20
Toward the
века
beginning
эти
of the
цифры
20th
возросли
century,
в
there were
50 раз.
tens
И по
more.
данным на
By 1917, there were around 200 stone structures only in Greater Saratov, all of them architectural marvels.
И причем каждый из них представлял собой шедевр архитектуры. Достаточно посмотреть сейчас на
Now those
останки
monuments are
сохранившихся
basically
церквей
ruins.
на руинах,
It's tragic to look at them today and see cows and horses grazing inside their walls.
Чтобы понять, насколько плачевным является это зрелище в настоящее время. То, что это были
The fact that they were masterpieces of architecture cannot be argued. There are no analogs to those structures, even in Europe. First of all, they were built taking a lot of different styles into account. So the Volga Germans developed their own unique style, with Gothic and classical elements. We see Gothic turrets, classic columns. Of course, we need to preserve this architectural inheritance. It's well known that Saratov had, starting with 1856, the only Roman Catholic diocese in all of Russia, created specifically for German Catholics. So Catholic traditions are very strong in the Volga area. In our time, Catholics took a very brave step and sent a priest to revive a church in Kamenka. I've been there more than once and have spoken with the representatives of the municipal government and law enforcement. 10 years ago, a forged steel chest was stolen from the altar of this church. But a lot of the paintings and decorations are still on the walls, and the priest tried to restore the church. But tragically, such a project requires so much money, so many resources, that it's impossible to do it alone. Several years ago, lightning struck the spire of the church, so we cannot see it today as it stood not too long ago.
Одному ему не удастся справиться с такой тяжелой работой. К сожалению, несколько лет назад в шпиль церкви ударила молния, и поэтому мы не можем сегодня уже видеть церковь в той первозданной красоте.
Sad as it may be, not one of these churches, with the exception of Mark's, former Katarinitstadt, will ever be home to a service. They simply stand as witnesses to the history of German colonists.
И они, наверное, будут такими молчаливыми свидетелями истории немцев-колонистов.
И вновь вернемся в прошлое, когда на территории
So let's return again to the past, when German immigrants who came from diverse regions and cultural and religious backgrounds colonized the expanse of the Russian Empire. They were all carriers of the Western European civilization.
Адаптируясь к суровым российским условиям, немцы сохраняли свою
Adapting to the
ментальность,
difficult conditions they encountered in Russia, they were able to preserve their mentality. These immigrants were unique in their strong religious beliefs, discipline, hard-working character, a love for order, and respect for others. Many Christian families were very closely knit and didn't stray from their relatives or their original villages. They preserved their language, religion, and culture. This is the only known case of European immigrants who didn't assimilate into the culture of their adoptive country. This is a phenomenon of global magnitude and calls for thorough study. Basically, the colonists isolated themselves and very rarely made contact with the outside world. That's exactly why they were able to preserve their traditions. Holy Night, the biggest and most important holiday for the Volga Germans, was celebrated for 2 days. Its main attribute was a pine tree decorated with candles, homemade cookies, and candies. On Christmas Eve, the colonists dressed up and went to church, and after service, they continued the celebration in their homes. Germans who came to Russia also brought with them the legend of the Easter Bunny. The descendants of the colonists now argue which holiday was more important to their ancestors, Christmas or Easter. It's interesting that the Volga Germans had a tradition, one that doesn't exist today, of not only rewarding children for their accomplishments during Christmas, but also of punishing them. Children were brought to the Christmas tree, and by the way, the Christmas tree appeared in the colonies only toward the end of the 19th century. Since it was difficult to obtain a pine tree in the steppe, they had to buy it in Saratov. So often there was only one tree for the whole colony, and they put it in the church or sometimes in the school or the prayer house. On the day of the service, or whenever colonists gathered around the tree, children were visited by Beltsnikol, or the punishing man, whom the parents informed in advance of all the wrongdoings their children committed during the year. So this man had a switch, and a child had to jump over the switch or branch the number of times that corresponded with the number of sins he or she committed during the year. And only after that appeared the character who gave out presents and granted wish to the children. Easter was also a really big holiday, and children also received presents on that day. They made wishes and asked the Easter Bunny to bring them candy and other things. Of course, there was a tradition of painting eggs. The egg was a symbol of life. Families painted eggs with onion peels and brought them to their neighbors. Some colonists remember receiving 100 eggs during Easter, since everyone saw it as his or her mission to bring an egg to every person who lived in the village. Children put boots, baskets, and bags under their beds and waited for the Easter Bunny to bring them presents. In some colonies, children put containers in front of their doors. Each family had its own tradition, but the idea was basically the same. Children got presents for Easter. Germans also associated the Easter celebration with greeting the sun. Many made it a point to wake up early on that day, because with the sun they could see the Lamb of Christ. And on the eve of Easter, Germans celebrated Fastnacht. On that day they drew crosses on their homes with charcoal to ward off evil spirits, and made straw pastries and pancakes. Pans were the most used tools in the kitchen. The Ascension of Christ was celebrated by visiting cemeteries. The whole religious community visited the graves of ancestors.
Считается, что кладбища строились в немецких колониях.
It's thought that cemeteries were built as soon as churches were erected. The church, school, and cemetery were the three important centers in each colony. I myself had the chance to interview residents of the village Yagodnaya Polyana, and they said that the soil in the steppe froze solid during the winter, which didn't happen in Europe. So they had to dig graves in the summer to bury those who died in the winter. Protestants didn't have as strong a tradition of holding a funeral service as did Catholics. Really, Protestants don't even have a tradition of holding a wake. But since the colonies were surrounded by an Orthodox population, Germans took on some of the Russian rituals. By the end of the 19th century, they started to hold wakes for the dead, though the practice wasn't originally present in Germany. The time for weddings was late autumn and the week before Christmas. Marriage in the German colonies was accompanied by many ceremonies. According to archival data, starting in 1830, marriage was allowed only for women 16 years or older, and for men no younger than 18 years of age. However, according to some descendants of colonists alive today, these age restrictions were often violated, and many Germans got married when they were much younger. But there were certain rules that had to be abided. For example, couples had to have a document of approval from the Office of Guardianship of Foreigners and permission from their parents. Before getting married, couples were tested by the priest on their knowledge of the catechism and the dogma of the religion they belonged to. It was very difficult, if not impossible, to dissolve a marriage. After new regulations imposed by the Church in 1832, divorce was possible in certain extreme cases. If your spouse is absent for 5 or more years, if he or she is very ill, or if your spouse has committed a crime.
Совершение преступления мужем или женой и так далее, то у католиков расторгнуть брак фактически не представлялось
возможным. For Catholics, on the other hand, divorce was not even presented as an option. I have found some documents in the archives that deny divorce to wives who had not seen their husbands for 11, 15 years, since the Catholic Church saw marriage as dissolved only by the death of a spouse. The Church argued that since the spouse could not be proven dead in those cases, divorce was not possible.
Заключается буквально в следующем. Поскольку нет сведений о том, что супруг является умершим, брак расторгнуть не представляется возможным.
There were interesting punishments for those who became pregnant before marriage.
Существовали в случае нарушений супружеской верности, в
I
случае
have found some accounts of
рождения
these
ребенка
rituals in the
до брака. Мне
archive.
лично попадались в архиве данные о том, как наказывались
In
женщины,
the church,
совершавшие вот такие
a spot was painted
преступления.
black near the
В
altar,
лютеранских
and the
церквях
woman who conceived
около
before
алтаря
marriage
стояло
stood in
специальное
its center
место,
while the
которое
priest spoke
красилось
about the
черной
evil of such a
краской.
sin.
Девушка на
Then,
богослужении
she
должна
was
была
sentenced
встать
to
в
certain
центр этого
specific
черного круга,
punishments, which
прослушать
ranged from
проповедь
fasting to
священника
prayers to
о
kneeling,
вреде
and for the
подобных
course of
грехов.
1 to 2
И
months,
затем ее
the woman was
отлучали от
banished
церкви
from the
и
church.
приговаривали к епитимии. Епитимия – это достаточно широкий спектр наказания от многодневного поста, молитв, стояние на коленях и так далее. И в течение месяца или 2 девушка объявлялась отлученной от церкви. Она должна была поститься, возможно,
Sometimes
отправлялась в
she even had to go to a
монастырь
correctional
Через
facility.
2 месяца
When she
возвращалась,
returned after
вставала
2
вновь на
months,
этот же
she
черный
again
круг.
stood in the same black circle.
Пастор
The priest
отпускал ей
forgave her
совершенный
sins,
грех.
and if
И
this was a
затем,
Catholic
если
church,
это
then
были
she could send a
католики, то
request
она
for
могла
forgiveness
подать
to Rome
прошение,
and
которое
receive
называлось
permission to marry the father of her
диспенсацией, оно
illegitimate
отправлялось в Рим.
child.
И
If she was
получить разрешение
Lutheran,
на заключение
then the
брака
Office
с
for
отцом своего
Guardianship of
внебрачного
Foreigners
ребенка.
simply gave
Если это
permission
были
for marriage
лютеране, то
and granted
у них
legal
всё
status to
проходило
the
намного
child.
проще. Контора опекунства позволяла ей заключить брак и признать ребенка законно рожденным.
Немцы в Поволжье жили большими семьями, иногда по 30-40
The Volga
человек.
Germans lived in very large families, sometimes consisting of 30 to 40 people. The father was the head of the family, and his power was inherited by one of the sons, or when he had no sons, a daughter. The eldest and youngest members of the family didn't have rights. The father distributed inheritance as he pleased. If the parents of underage children died, then their property was sold by the colony representative, and the money was divided between the children.
Овдовевшая женщина могла сама продолжать вести хозяйство.
A widowed
или,
wife
выйдя замуж,
could continue
передать
to maintain a
управление
household
хозяйством
herself
своему
or
мужу.
remarry, thus passing the power over to her new husband.
Культурно-бытовой уклад жизни немцев Поволжья
The
резко
lifestyle
отличался
of
от
Volga
окружавшего
Germans
их
was
русского
very
и
different from that of the
украинского
surrounding
населения.
Russian and
Немецкие
Ukrainian
колонии, в отличие от
populations.
соседних русских
Unlike the
поселений,
Russian neighbors,
имели широкие
German colonies had
прямые
wide,
улицы.
straight
В центре
streets.
деревни площадь. Перед
The
домами
middle of every
обязательно
village had a
посажены
square,
деревья.
and trees
Вход в
grew in
дом
front
со
of
двора.
every house, and
Хозяйственные
wooden
постройки,
crafts
сделанные
decorated
из
the
дерева,
house's entrance.
образовывали квадрат. Жилое помещение
The
делилось
living
на
space
три
was divided
части,
into three
поперек
parts,
конька
with the
крыши,
kitchen being in the
кухней,
middle.
расположенной посередине. Отапливали дом
Homes were
соломой
heated using
или
straw
высушенным
or
на
dried
солнце
dung
навозом,
formed into bricks,
сформированным в брикете.
enough of which was
Его
prepared in July
заготовляли
to last the
обычно
whole
в
winter.
июле на всю зиму.
For a very long time, colonists tried to remain self-sufficient, so much so that they even whittled their own matches. They dipped them in a phosphorus solution and stored on a wooden plank, using them throughout the year for igniting the stove. Germans also had a signature design for a yoke. The Russian design was straight, and it was used mainly by women to carry buckets of water on their shoulders. The German yoke had a unique dip to accommodate the neck, which made carrying loads much easier.
И практически, в общем-то, это было очень наиболее удобным, вот такое несение ведер.
Приметы немецкого жилища – множество вышитых настенных ковров с изречениями. В
A staple
основном
of the German
пожеланиями
house was
и
always a
духами
multitude of
счастья.
wall rugs and
Большие
tapestries with
деревянные
sayings sewn
кровати
into
с
them,
жесткими
mostly
матрацами
wishes of
и
love and
пуховыми
happiness.
перинами. Множество
Beds were
подушек.
wooden, with hard
Кровать обычно
mattresses,
стояла в
down
углу лучшей
comforters,
комнаты.
and lots of
На ней
pillows.
спал глава
The bed
семьи
usually
супруг.
stood in the corner of the
Остальные
nicest room of the
размещались
house,
на ночь
and
на
the head of the
полу,
family
в
slept in it with his wife.
На
The rest
полках
of the
и
family
шкафах,
spent their nights on the floor,
разусланных яркими
sometimes in the same room.
коробки для сыпучих продуктов. В музеях бережно хранятся образцы одежды поволжских немцев. Летом мужчины
Museums
носили
treasure
белую
articles of
рубаху,
clothing worn by the
темные
Volga
холщовые
Germans.
панталоны,
In the summer,
жилетку с
a man wore a
пуговицами,
white shirt,
длиннополый
dark
сюртук.
linen trousers,
Женщины
a
летом
buttoned
одевали
vest, and a
короткие
long
юбки,
overcoat.
передники, белые рубашки и
Women would
туфли.
wear short
На голове
skirts,
платок,
aprons,
на ногах
white
белые,
shirts,
синие
and
или
on their heads,
пестрые чулки
light scarves or
домашней
handkerchiefs,
работы.
and on their
Зимой
legs,
немцы ходили
white,
в овчинных
blue, or
тулупах,
dotted stockings.
полушубках и меховых
In the
шапках.
winter, Germans wore shearling coats and fur
сбривали
hats,
бороды и усы.
and men shaved their facial hair.
Кухня поволжских немцев существенно
The cuisine of
отличалась
German
от
colonists
традиций
was
питания
quite different from the
окружающего
traditional
их
food of the
русского
surrounding Russian population.
населения. По утрам
Germans woke up to a
обычно пили
breakfast
пшеничный
starting with a
или
cup of
ячменный
coffee
кофе,
made
готовили
out of wheat or
мучные или
barley,
картофельный
followed by
суп.
flour or
Любимым
potato
блюдом
soup.
было свиное мясо.
A favorite dish
Его
was always
изготовляли
pork,
впрок,
which was
делали
cured,
домашние
smoked,
колбасы,
and made into
копчености.
sausage.
Ежедневно
Vegetables were
ели
always
овощи.
part of the daily
Что касается
nutrition.
питания и одежды, интересно, что русское население,
When it comes to clothing and
вот,
cuisine,
наверное, в этом мы
it's
можем
interesting that we
увидеть
see such a massive integration of two
адаптацию
cultures,
и
Russian
взаимопроникновение
and
культур.
German.
Русской культуры в немецкую, немецкой в русскую. Огромное количество слов, которые были заимствованы
A
русским и
huge amount of
украинским
German
населением
words were
немцев.
adopted into
Огромное
Ukrainian and
количество
Russian.
блюд, которые
Especially
были
names of
заимствованы,
German dishes are now used all over Russia, like the name of a German cake,
да, и так
Kuchen.
далее. То есть все вот эти вот названия были заимствованы русским населением.
However, the
И,
Russian adoption
когда
of
берешь
German words
интервью
and dishes
у
did not
потомков
necessitate an acceptance of
очень
German
интересно,
culture.
что до сих пор они
When we have
вспоминают,
interviewed the
когда мы
descendants
выезжали
of
за
original
пределы
colonists,
колонии,
they remember that when they left their
мальчишки
villages to
бросали
go
друг
into
на друга
Saratov city,
камнями, показывали
children would throw
пальцами и
stones at them and
кричали:
yell,
"Немцы идут,
"Germans
немцы
are
идут".
coming!"
Основополагающими жизненными ценностями российских немцев
The main
традиционно
values
были
of Russian Germans were
собственность,
property,
церковь,
church and faith,
а
and
важнейшая часть
education.
их ментальности – высокая
An important
самоорганизация.
aspect of their mentality was
Наиболее
always
ощутимой,
self-organization.
устойчивой и эффективной
This was
она
most
была в
evident in village
промежности,
meetings.
в приходах и сельских сходах. Колонией обычно управлял староста, который вместе с
Colonies were usually ruled by an elder alongside two elected officials from the older generation, representatives of the court to help pass judgment, and a scribe or a secretary. 4 to 6 colonies created a district, ruled by district heads and 2 district representatives, who were elected for 3 years. Government care was a huge factor. Imagine how Russian villages were formed. They were made up of either refugees who didn't really want to work, or former serfs who didn't really have much motivation either. And what was there to do with the German colonists? They were a multicultural mass. Over 10 years, those who were not used to hard manual labor were excommunicated. They were given indulgences and they left for other cities. By the 1880s, colonies really only consisted of people who wanted to work. That way, the lumpen of the population was eliminated from the colonies. And when a clear economic structure emerged, it allowed people to work. Also, the Russian government regulated the lives of the colonies, which it didn't do for Russian settlements. There were commissioners who made sure that everything was painted, maintained. People were prosecuted for littering. So, until the 1880s or so, government control, to some extent, helped form the accurateness of the German colonists.
Он в какой-то степени формировал вот эту немецкую педантичность. Плюс то, что они принесли, и плюс еще здесь вот этот государственный контроль сделал их такими людьми, которые фактически смогли очень многое.
So all these factors created a people that were able to overcome and transform the economic reality of the Volga region. Starting with the 1840s, migration processes developed among the population of the Volga Germans. Scholars still debate the reasons and motivations of the settlers that made them move from the organized and developed territories to new destinations. Over the following 150 years, Germans had several waves of migration, and masses of people changed residence 3 to 4 times, adjusting to new environmental and socioeconomic conditions. The geography of habitation of Germans from Russia expanded dramatically over the last third of the 19th century, when immigration to Americas became rather considerable. I've analyzed these processes, and really, the first wave of migration affected a very minor portion of colonists, mainly sectarians. Some of them didn't want to serve in the army based on their religious beliefs, and began to seek out ways to leave. It was the fear of being in the army, and not because one would have to serve. People were afraid of the language barrier, and that's very serious. In the 1870s and 80s, there were major land issues. Germans were given the opportunity to form daughter colonies, but again, they lived in isolation in terms of language and in every other way. They didn't have the economic mobility that Russians had, who could simply move to the city if land was scarce. So the colonists had to emigrate.
А к тому же они узнали о том, что здесь работали соответствующие агенты из Америки. И они рассказывали, какие земли и какого
In addition, word was spreading that American agents were coming to Russia to talk about all the land available in the New World. The first wave of emigration finished in 1879, when people started coming back after not finding success in South America. But with the massive droughts of 1886 and 1887, the crop failures in 1891, and the constant word coming in from America that there Germans could get whatever amount of land they needed, immigration continued.
а в экономике тогда Америки начался подъем, земли выдавались сколько хочешь, поэтому это послужило толчком, что остальная часть стала эмигрировать.
There were so many problems associated with the emigration. Colonists couldn't sell their land. It was communal. Those who were rich, who had houses, weren't leaving. And the poor had nothing to leave with. So they went into a lot of debt and really took a big risk by leaving. In certain cases, a cordon was placed on the border of Prussia and Russia and didn't allow Germans through. If you could pay 75 rubles, then you could get through. Some Germans arrived in Prussia but didn't have the money to get to America, and they were turned away. So there were a lot of problems on the border. Later, before leaving the country, immigrants had to present documents proving they didn't have any debt in Russia. One had to go through a lengthy procedure to receive the right papers to leave and had the money to get to America. And after that, relatives sent money from the U.S. to those who were trying to leave Russia. Mostly people sold whatever they had, their cattle, but even that wasn't very much money. So emigration was very difficult, and those who were able to leave had to be very persistent. There is a book by American historian Richard Schuermann, Volga Germans, Pioneers of the Northwest, in which he explains everything very clearly. When Germans arrived in America during the 1880s and 1890s, Western soil was still under the control of Indians. Immigrants were given weapons by the U.S. government and were offered to take the land by force. And they did, without any sentiments. The economic factor was the ruling one. It was the major motivation for those who left Germany for Russia in the 1700s, for those who went to America at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. The same happened 100 years later with those who went from Russia back to Germany in the 1980s. People were not leaving to touch the soil of their ancestors or get back to their roots. Material well-being was the real motivation, as usual. By 1913, around 2,400,000 Germans lived in the Russian Empire. According to historians, it was in this very year that the final wave of emigration took place. There was the feeling that it was a premonition. The biggest amount of people left specifically in 1913. And in 1914, either because of some restrictions or for some other reasons, this emigration stopped. Later, there was only a little wave of emigration after October of 1917, in accordance with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Scholars research factors separately, either economic or social. But we have to look at them together, as the moral, ethical factor was part of everything, but it's not really researched. During the First World War, an anti-German campaign started up in Russia. German schools were closed, and it was prohibited to use German in writing documents and exchanging letters. By an imperial order, the government was preparing to evict the German population from the Volga region and move them to Siberia. This was interrupted by the Bolsheviks coming to power in October of 1917. The new power adopted a Declaration of Rights of the Peoples of Russia, in which groups had the right to self-governance. In 1918, on behalf of the Russian National Commissariat for the Nationalities, Stalin declared, "Bolsheviks are standing for such autonomy, where the bourgeois are restricted not only from political power, but also from participation in civil elections." We are standing in the former German colony of Varenburg, or the village of Privalnaya. We're in the central square, and behind me is a Lutheran church. This was a Lutheran village with its own customs and traditions. It was a really rich mercantile community. Trade blossomed here. It was especially vibrant at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. After the October Revolution, this village was known for hosting the Summit of Representatives from all the German colonies in February of 1918. They decided to make a plea to the Bolshevik government for territorial autonomy. The history of the Republic of Volga Germans began at this very moment. The settlement is also known for the fact that in January of 1919, at the very peak of the installation of politics of militant communism, in the middle of a massive takeover of industry and violence against peasants, it was home to one of the biggest uprisings in the Volga. It was provoked by the actions of the provision collectors sent from cities who were taking bread from colonists. The Wartenburg settlers wouldn't put up with this and destroyed the department, its members, and then basically called the village a sovereign territory free from Bolshevik rule. There were several attempts to appease the colony, but all failed. According to accounts of some German Bolsheviks, a special battalion was sent here from Balzer, or modern Krasnoarmeysk. They sent cavalry and ground troops that tried to storm the settlement, but the villagers had prepared for this. They put up fortifications on the streets and installed a machine gun in the church steeple, so when the Red Army entered the village, the streets were all blocked and the troops couldn't retreat and were shot down.
Красноармейцы попытались отступить, но по улицам было невозможно проехать, поэтому все они были уничтожены.
The Germans were able to defend their village for over a week. Finally, the army sent a special battalion from Saratov, who brutally put down the German uprising. Around 40 people were shot here on this square. The instigators who tried to go into hiding with their leader, Johann Wornsbecker, were found several days later and hanged in this church steeple to scare the bourgeoisie of the world. This colony is also famous for yet another event. Much later, in the years of collectivization, former residents told of a local communist activist who wanted to take down the cross from this church and replace it with a star. So the next day he climbed up to the top of the church during a thunderstorm, threw down the cross, and right then was hit by lightning. Studies of this period of Volga German history by historians at Saratov State University, and this is evident from the example of the Republic of Volga Germans, prove that autonomy didn't exist for Soviet republics, and self-governance was, in practice, a fiction. The lifestyle of the German colonists was most oppressed during the time that they were supposedly autonomous. With the aid of the Republic, its people, the officials that governed it, the central government had control of the German population. It was during the existence of German autonomy that the biggest act of mistreatment was committed against the Volga Germans. For this people, the most treasured values were always property, education, and the church. These three things were destroyed in Soviet times. Collectivization forced all Germans to work in the kolkhoz, or collective farms. They became hired hands who owned nothing. The national school for colonists was replaced with a Soviet one, and the church was simply destroyed. Tens of churches were demolished. Lutherans, Catholics, Mennonites, and members of all other denominations could only congregate and worship underground in secret. This is what the Republic led to.
Заниматься, так сказать, своими религиозными делами только подпольно, тайно. Вот к чему привела республика.
Despite the fact that in 1932 a constitution was adopted in the German Republic that promised the right of political freedom to its citizens, there were horrible repressions executed by the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB, and the organization that ran Russian gulags. The government was afraid of a so-called fifth column. Since Russian relations were poor with Nazi Germany, it was assumed that all Germans residing in the USSR were potential spies. Therefore, when Russia went to war with Germany in 1941, deportation of colonists became just a rung in a long chain of mass repression on behalf of the Soviet government.
Допускала советская власть по отношению к немцам.
On August 28, 1941, a decree of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR was issued ordering all Germans presently residing in the areas around the Volga River to be transported to other areas of the country, and a total deportation of colonists was enacted. To advance this operation, the Republic of Volga Germans was occupied by NKVD troops. Soldiers knocked on our door and said, "Time to leave." We began to load a cart, and then it turned out that we could only take a limited amount of things with us. And when they brought us to the train, they didn't allow us to even bring that. I took with me a bag of flour and some butter. They made me leave the rest. People were crying. A lot of them thought they'd be taken to the Volga and drowned. We sang psalms and readied ourselves for death. 700,000 Germans were evicted from the European part of the country by January 1st, 1942. Of those, 420,000 came from the Volga region. The wagons were overfilled. We had to squeeze into them. They were moving us like cattle. When we arrived at the station, there were crowds of Russians who looked at us with contempt. God forgive them. They didn't see what they were doing. They thought we weren't people, that we had horns on our heads. They said, "Look, the fascists have arrived." But when they saw we were regular people just like them, they were ashamed. People were sent to remote regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan. The majority of them would never return to their homeland. When Germans were evicted, we had a camp for prisoners. The area was surrounded with barbed wire. The church was turned into a repair shop.
И охраняли, потому что заключенные были, которые политически свободные ходили, а такие, что за криминал, их охраняли. Когда Сталин умер, распустили.
When Stalin died, the camp was dissolved, and starting in 1953, it was transformed into a state farm, or savkhoz.
И тогда стали приглашать людей сюда.
And when they started to invite people back here, "Come, there's land and there are houses here," everything was left. But they never returned the Germans back here.
Депортация стала превентивной мерой, которую провело советское руководство, опасаясь,
The Soviet population
что
saw
немцы
deportation
могут
as a
оказаться
preventative
нелояльными и
measure
помочь
by the government
противнику.
out of fear that Germans might be disloyal.
Как тогда, так и до настоящего времени в том, что там немцы
However,
по
there were
Волге
never
каким-то
and
образом
still
помогали
aren't
нацистам,
real
нет.
facts that might indicate the Germans may have
Но для
somehow
самого
helped the fascists.
немецкого народа, для немцев по Волжье, депортация стала еще
For the
одним
most peaceful
страшным
people,
ударом,
deportation
который
was just
привел
another
фактически
furious
к
blow,
распаду этой этнической
one that
группы.
led to the dissolution of this
Дело в том,
ethnic group.
что в республике немцев по Волжье они проживали на маленькой территории
In their little
27
republic,
тысяч квадратных
almost
километров,
400,000 Germans
400
resided on
человек.
27,000 square
Теперь
kilometers
по
of
огромной
land.
территории Сибири и Казахстана в
After
5 миллионов
deportation,
квадратных
they were
километров.
scattered across the
И более
vast
того, было
territories of
специальное,
Siberia and Kazakhstan, spanning 5 million square kilometers.
где разрешалось не
Moreover,
больше 3
there was a special
семей
order from the government which stated that no more than 3 to 4 families could reside in one village.
очень
All of
активно.
this began what became a very active process of assimilation. In September of 1941, many Russian soldiers of German nationality who were drafted into the Red Army were relocated from the battlefront into the country to serve and support troops. All other people of German nationality, both men and women aged from 15 to 55 who had children older than 3 years of age, were mobilized into the Labor Army. The Labor Army was organized on the principle of a typical Soviet labor camp, or gulag. By 1942, hardly any Germans living in Russia weren't sent to gulags. We had to work, work, and work. We weren't allowed to talk. This country was no longer our home. I worked as a milkmaid. Then my father and brother were taken into the Labor Army, and I stayed with my mother and worked plowing and sowing fields. I had to work no matter what the cost. My hands are proof of that. They lost the will to live. Their stomachs could no longer accept food. A lot of them died there.
Эти люди фактически были прикреплены.
These people were basically incarcerated in the NKVD camps, and their position wasn't very different from that of prisoners. They lived under the same conditions, had the same food, the same guards, barbed wire. Without telling people for what they were at fault, they were put into confinement and weren't even told for how long. Unlike prisoners who know they'll be set free after 10, 15, 20 years, the Germans weren't given any time frames. And of course it was this mass mobilization, labor in the difficult northern conditions, and the work was mostly logging and wood processing, construction of waterways, construction of roads, so it was immensely difficult labor.
Со строительством дорог и так далее. То есть это был тяжелейший физический труд. И практически государство само себе наносило урон,
And practically,
поскольку
the government really
очень много
handicapped
крупных
itself
специалистов,
because it made some of its most talented engineers just ordinary workers.
были простыми рабочими, направлены
The result of the Labor Army was a really huge physical blow to the Russian-German
в
population.
результате
A fourth of the Volga Germans died in the labor camps from disease, hunger, exhaustion, the extreme cold.
фактически где-то четверть
Children were left without parents, put into orphan homes, and lost all contact with each other.
Прежде всего, это
This was a
истощение
huge
от
tragedy.
голода, от непосильного труда, от морозов. Дети остались беспризорными. Их определяли в детские дома. То есть тысячи семей потеряли связи друг с другом. Это была, конечно, очень большая трагедия.
Трудовая армия была расформирована только в 1946 году.
The Labor Army was dissolved only in 1946. Surviving Germans were permitted to return to their homes, the Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan. That's where their relatives lived. Until 1956, all Germans lived in restricted zones as special settlers and had to report monthly to a central office.
Лишены возможности передвигаться по стране.
Germans were prohibited from moving about the country and confined to reservations. In 1948, a new state legislation was issued that not only banned Germans from leaving the reservations, but also pronounced all those who left the reservations to the moment as criminals who should be arrested and punished with 20 years of confined labor.
Выйти за как бы околицу, вот, карал немцев 20 годами каторжных работ. Самое интересное, что в Уголовном кодексе СССР
By the way, the criminal law of the USSR didn't contain any such punishment for its citizens. It was reserved only for Germans. Memories of Russian Germans of these harsh years are filled with tragedy, suffering, and the loss of family. An entire population was prohibited from speaking their native language, as a result of which the majority of Russian Germans became the most assimilated ethnic group in the entire country. Having your nationality listed as German in your passport meant you had no chance of getting into a respected school, no political security, and no opportunity to overcome your status. The Soviet government wanted Germans to accept their fate, to stay in their place of residence, because Russia needed the 1,200,000 workers in the eastern parts of the country, so leaving those areas wasn't an option. After Khrushchev came to power, the government loosened its control on the Soviet German population. But even the dissolution of the reservations, which came on December 12, 1955, didn't give German families the right to return to the Volga. They couldn't come back to the territory of their autonomous republic, which was unlawfully confiscated from them, and couldn't reclaim lost property. Restrictions existed on the places Germans could live, study, and work until 1972, and a restriction on the release of this information to the public was effective until the mid-1980s. Slowly, the opportunity to research documents emerged. It turned out that many archives, central archives and the ones in the Volga region, contained one-of-a-kind documents on the history of the Volga Germans. There was even an entire archive of the former Republic of Volga Germans, the existence of which was kept completely in secret. I was one of the few scholars who went there in the late 1980s to work with the documents that had been sitting classified and thus unavailable for over 50 years. When I was looking at these documents, I had this feeling that I was touching something extraordinary. Industriousness, diligence, and discipline helped the German people adjust to a new environment. In 1991, legislation was passed for the rehabilitation of repressed peoples, which created new impulse for full rehabilitation of Russian Germans. Sadly, this rehabilitation still hasn't been realized, and because of this, millions of Russian Germans have left for Germany, and this process continues today. According to the last census, which was done in 2002, there are 597,212 Russian Germans residing in the Russian Federation today. There is a duality to the modern social status of these people. On one hand, there is cooperation between Russia and Germany for the creation of German societies and artistic collectives in Russia. On the other hand, Germans are continuously leaving Russia for Germany, and around 2 million people have already left. Volga Germans still don't have autonomy. Only several so-called German regions have been set aside in the Omsk and Altai areas, and the ongoing process of assimilation is dissolving this unique ethnicity. However, German Russians managed to do the impossible. Despite being for decades a repressed people in a totalitarian state, they were able to preserve and pass to new generations their unique culture, language, and traditions. There's no doubt that this is a unique historical community. We as historians often delve into antiquity, and through archaeology try to piece together a civilization that has long disappeared. Here, however, studying written history of one ethnos, we're able to see, just by looking at documents, the formation, the development, the blossoming, and then the actual demise of the whole people, the Russian Germans.
В Саратовском государственном университете активно работает
The Center for Research of German-Russian History and Culture was founded in 1999 as part of the School of History at Saratov State University. Now it is a research center and an organic part of the unique international project Russian Germans as Pioneers of Globalization, 250 years of a humanitarian mission uniting peoples and continents. The center is working on the project in cooperation with Colorado State University in a strategic partnership.
This is a longer story. The German Russians who settled in Colorado also settled on the Volga, and they are the ones who bring us together first. So while this historic migration brings us together, it is higher education issues that also bring us together. In a global economy and a global society, collaboration among universities is essential.
Is it possible to say that it is the unique project for the collaboration?
It's very unique. This is a real opportunity for the two universities to set a 21st century example for collaboration.
The university already has around 60 collaborative agreements with foreign academic institutions around the world. But all of them are somewhat specific, each focused on a single academic problem or research topic. We are now building our relationship with Colorado State University on the basis of a new concept of international strategic partnership that creates a very unique integration of our universities. We have a complex of joint academic programs, like the study of German-Russian history, research in biogenetics and agricultural sciences, as well as in laser physics, nanotechnology, mathematics, and in other fields. It is an interdisciplinary and multifaceted cooperation at its core. This is a partnership between two universities that are, in reality, very close to each other in terms of historical legacy, public role, and modern academic mission.
Проект получил поддержку государственных органов в России и в Соединенных Штатах Америки. В консорциум проекта планирует войти также университеты
The project has received government support in Russia and in the United States. Universities in Germany, Ukraine, Poland, and South Africa are also planning to enter the consortium. The venture will be financed by both government and private funds. The Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie Foundations have already expressed interest in aiding the project.
По нескольким направлениям, включая изучение документов и материалов по социально-экономической, политической, культурной, региональной, общинной, семейной истории, этнографии, антропологии.
The program will conduct research on several different levels, which will include a study of documents and materials on the socioeconomic, political, cultural, regional, communal, and familial aspects of Russian Germans. This will be an in-depth ethnographic study of Russian Germans based largely on documents stored today in archives.
Научных и учебных стажировок для участников проекта в архивных и научных учреждениях США, включая стажировки для работников.
The results will be presented in international publications, history conferences, and in other academic forums.
Университетов в архивах Саратовской области. Проект предусматривает специализированные гранты для совершенствования материальной базы архивов.
The project includes grants for archives, restoration of documents, and introduction of digital technology into archival preservation. The goal of this research is really interesting. Russian Germans, Volga Germans, are such a unique ethnicity. They arrived from Germany some long time ago, and then after having lived in Russia for over 100 years, began to leave for different reasons and disperse all over the world. Europe, North America, South America, even Africa and Australia. So now these people exist all over the globe.
И в Европу, и в Северную Америку, и в Южную, и даже в Африку, и в Австралию. Таким образом получилось, что эти люди расселились по всему земному шару.
What's most astonishing is they don't identify themselves as Germans from Germany. They feel they belong to the areas their ancestors colonized, which includes the Volga.
Именно чувствуют себя немцами тех регионов, откуда они выселились. Ну, в частности, немцами Поволжья.
This can be said of Germans from Colorado or of Germans residing in any other corner of the world. A fairly limited number of families immigrated to the Volga region in the 1700s. Then they spread across the whole world, and family members lost each other. Genealogical lines disconnected, and it's very important now to try and reconnect them, to show the fates of relatives, neighbors, where they went, what their descendants are doing.
Снова их объединить, эти линии, показать, как же их родственники, да и другие соседи когда-то, те, кто был соседями, какова сложилась их судьба, куда они попали, что и чем занимаются потомки их и так далее.
This is all fascinating, and the final goal of this project is a humanitarian one. It's to connect people, to give them the opportunity to know more about each other.
Все могли друг о друге узнать.
Изучение истории и культуры российских немцев – это не только
The study of Volga German culture and history is not just the placing of events in chronological order.
огромной многонациональной страны. Историко-социальный феномен глобального масштаба.
It is the study of a one-of-a-kind social phenomenon, the only known group of Europeans who colonized the expanse of Eastern Europe and preserved their culture through centuries. Perhaps this is the only true example of globalization, of a people who made its way through Europe, Russia, America, and even other corners of the world, all the while preserving its accumulated knowledge of agriculture, traditions, and the culture of its ancestors.